Chapter 35, The Visit, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu had felt shy about going to visit Lord Theodora when Antony announced their destination. Kenta seemed happy with her, and she had been nice to Hanyu himself and wonderfully sweet and forgiving with old Chihiro, but her face was so forbidding that Hanyu couldn't help feeling apprehensive at the idea of going into her inner sanctum. Antony's slight form beside him quelled the feeling a little, even as the god stopped before a door and reached for the handle. He wished he could grab Antony's hand and squeeze, but even without that contact, it was impossible not to feel a little reassured by divine protection. As soon as Hanyu stepped through Lord Theodora's door, his fizzing nerves subsided into a strange, tilting sense of déjà vu. He felt as if he were back at the temple. The sitting room, if it could be called that, looked for all the world like a dormitory's common area. There was a single enormous cabinet fixed to one wall. Other than that, the room was dominated by a large table with a dozen chairs bolted around it. The chairs contained 3 men, reading and chatting with each other. They barely glanced up when the door opened, as if there tended to be a great deal of coming and going from this room, but their eyes widened and they scrambled to their feet when they saw who had entered. One pair of startled eyes, Hanyu saw with delight, belonged to Kenta. "My Lord Antony, you really did come back!" Kenta jumped up from his spot at the table with a bright smile and hurried over to make his bow. Back? Antony must have visited Lord Theodora sometime last night. "Hello, Kenta," Antony greeted. Hanyu noticed that his master sounded a little uncomfortable. Maybe it was because Kenta was smiling so much. He said it before that he hadn't liked Hanyu smiling at first. "Lord Theodora is sitting with Chihiro," Kenta said, once the god had bidden him back to his feet. "I can take you there if you like." As they followed Kenta past the table, Hanyu stole a glance down at the other men. He had hoped to see Bunta, but these men were both significantly older than the friendly escort. Maybe he would see him tomorrow when he went to exercise. He was expecting to enter another room when they passed through the doorway, but instead he found himself in a tight hallway swathed in heavy curtains. He was confused for a second, then realized that the curtains were dividing the room into multiple smaller spaces. Lord Theodora's rooms were, if anything, bigger than Antony's, and she had 4 instead of 2. However, the multitude of little curtained chambers seemed to press in on Hanyu. He felt a little claustrophobic until they finally pushed through a curtain and entered one of the rooms. It was a little bigger than he had expected. There were lanterns placed around the room in addition to the torches fixed to the one wooden wall, keeping the space cheerfully well lit. There was a big soft chair, in which Lord Theodora was sitting and reading aloud from a fat little book. Her voice was a flat, undifferentiated drone, like Hanyu's classmates reciting the names of the kings. As the rogue plundered his all-too-willing mouth, the prince felt a delicious stirring, and his flesh scepter began to rise, like a serpent coaxed from its basket by— "Oh, Antony, thank goodness." She looked up from the book and sighed. "Can you believe what this lecture makes me read?" "Oh, we all know you love that kind of thing," Antony said. "Anyway, it's hard to get lecherous when you read it like that, my lord," Chihiro scolded from the bed. The old man didn't seem well. His skin had a yellowish tint that Hanyu didn't think was entirely due to the lamplight, and there was a sharp wheeze behind his voice when he spoke. But at least for the moment, he seemed to be aware of Lord Theodora and his warm relationship with her, and that felt like the more important thing. "All right, Master Orator, how would you read about flesh scepters?" Lord Theodora's voice was cheerful, but when she leaned forward to take Chihiro's hand, Hanyu couldn't help but think that there was a little desperation in the move. She must have wanted to cling to this moment of clarity while it lasted. "You should set Hanyu to work at that," Antony said. "He reads gorgeously." Hanyu flushed at the praise, and now that Lord Theodora was looking at him, he realized he'd been so caught up in watching her with Chihiro that he'd forgotten to bow. Of course, Kenta wasn't bowing either, and maybe no one had even noticed, and it felt a little silly to do it at this point. What was the worst that would happen if Lord Theodora took offense? He'd get caned again? That wasn't a particularly off-putting prospect. Hanyu stayed standing. "That's wonderful!" Lord Theodora didn't look offended by his lapse in propriety. She slipped from the chair and knelt by the bed, not relinquishing the old man's hand. "Would you like that, Chihiro?" "It's bound to be better than your reading." Chihiro patted her hand, and she laughed. "Do you want to take a turn, Hanyu?" Lord Theodora asked. "I don't generally put guests to work, but now I'm curious to hear you." Hanyu felt his blush deepen. First he'd had to read for someone who'd heard Messiah's poems. Now he had to read for the person she'd written them for. Kenta was already herding him forward. "Oh yes, he's wonderful, my lord. You'll be so impressed." Before he knew it, Hanyu was settled into the chair with the tale of flesh scepters in his hand. He was tempted to read it over dramatically, making a joke out of the terrible metaphors and featureless characters, but this book was Chihiro's choice. The old man found genuine enjoyment from it, he assumed, and so he resolved to read it with respect. He pitched his voice low and breathy for the remainder of the love scene, and then built the intensity as the post-coital lovers got into an inane argument. The prince felt his heart shattering inside of his chest. "You only wanted to bed me to settle a bet? Is that all I am to you? I never want to see you again!" He shoved the rogue, almost spraining his wrist when he pushed against the chiseled, diamond-hard abdomen. Hanyu was almost shouting by the time a hand tapped his knee and interrupted him. "He's asleep," Antony said. "You can stop now." Hanyu realized with a jolt of horror that Lord Antony, Lord Theodora, and Kenta were all sprawled on the floor while he sat in the only chair. He jolted to his feet, almost stepping on Antony's other hand in his haste. The god jerked away with a squawk of protest. Hanyu flushed even hotter. Forgive me, I didn't." "Your reading is exquisite," Lord Theodora interrupted. "Thank you. That was a real pleasure for him, and for us." Antony scooted closer to her to make room, and Hanyu knelt gratefully at his master's side. As long as he wasn't walking, he wouldn't step on anybody. "Reading aloud seems to help him relax," Lord Theodora went on. "He doesn't have to worry about remembering who we are, or what's going on from one moment to the next, or even following the story, so he can just let go. It's the same with Kenta's singing." "I told you you'd be impressed with Hanyu, my lord," Kenta enthused. Lord Theodora smiled at him. "You're right, I am." She turned her smile on Hanyu. "I've been impressed with him since the first time Antony mentioned him to us." Hanyu swelled with mingled pleasure and shyness. It still dazzled him a little to think that he was a topic of conversation among the gods. "You're too kind, my lord." "Not at all." Her gaze drifted back to the old man on the bed, whose snore had a piercing, whistling sharpness that made Hanyu nervous. "You were kind to read to him. Do you think... Would you do it again sometime? It would have to be sometime soon." Her voice didn't waver, but Hanyu suspected that the long pauses in her speech were the only reason for that. He wanted to wrap a blanket around her shoulders and bring her tea and offer to do all her chores, the way he used to do when one of his friends was sad. But Lord Theodora didn't suffer from the cold and couldn't drink tea, and she didn't have to do chores. None of his skills were useful right now. Why hadn't the temple trained them for this? He was glad that he knew how to dance and sing and offer sexual service, even if the offer would never be accepted, and take a punishment and make a presentable bow, but surely they could have included a lesson or two about what to do if a god seemed like they might be about to start crying. "Oh, Theo, I'm sorry." Antony wrapped his arm around the other god's broad shoulders and pulled her close. She didn't cry, but she did lean against Antony and heave a deep sigh. "I hope I'm not being selfish by keeping him here. I know he'd have more expert care with Felix, but Julia comes by every few days and she hasn't said that he needs to move yet." "Move where?" Hanyu blurted. As soon as the words left his mouth, he clapped his hand over it as if he could stuff them back in. "Oh, forgive me, my lord. Lords?" "It's all right." Lord Theodora shot him a wan smile over Antony's head. "Felix and Julia keep a few rooms for humans who need constant care." "I didn't know they were still doing that," Antony said softly. Lord Theodora gave a soggy scoff and rolled her eyes. "Of course they are. What else are we supposed to do? Tip everybody over the railing once their knees go bad?" Antony didn't respond, but Hanyu could see his flinch. He felt a swell of defensive indignation on his god's behalf, but then he saw that Lord Theodora's face was wet and the feeling evaporated. Oh no, no more might or maybe, she was crying. Lord Theodora, wave tamer, wind summoner, mighty of arm and all that, crying hard and silent right in front of him. "I'd love to read for him some more, my lord," Hanyu said in a rush. "Any time you want. Oh, with my master's permission, of course. Sorry, my lord, I didn't mean to presume." Antony waved his hand dismissively, and Hanyu forced himself to swallow the rest of the words crowding each other to spill out of his mouth. "Of course you can come," Antony said. "I'll escort you whenever you like. If I'm out, you're also allowed to go with Theodora or any of her offerings as long as you leave me a note." Hanyu nodded. "Thank you." Everything was quiet for a moment, the silence disturbed only by the old man snoring and the faint sounds of Lord Theodora's other offerings going about their day. Lord Theodora herself kept glancing up at Antony, then at Hanyu, then down at the floor again. "May I steal Hanyu for a few minutes, my lords?" Kenta asked suddenly. "I want to show him my rooms." Kenta had been so quiet, Hanyu had almost forgotten he was in the room. Now his friend ducked his head shyly as all eyes turned his way. "Of course," Lord Theodora said. "Antony?" Lord Antony looked less enthusiastic, almost panicked even, but he nodded. "All right." "Thank you, my lord." Kenta bowed deeply, then scrambled to his feet and helped Hanyu up as well. They passed into the makeshift hallway, then Kenta pulled him into one of the little curtain rooms. This one was smaller than Chihiro's, but it was certainly more space than either of them had ever had to themselves in the temple. There was a bed bolted to the floor, and a narrow dresser bolted to the wooden wall with a light blazing above it. Hanyu found himself a little impressed that all of this belonged to Kenta. "It's wonderful," Hanyu said earnestly. "Oh? Oh, the room!" Kenta flopped down on the bed and patted the mattress next to him in invitation. "I didn't actually want to show you my room. Well, I did, but mostly I thought our masters wanted to talk to each other alone." Damn it, he was probably right, and Hanyu hadn't noticed at all. A sow would have seen what his master wanted, so would stupid, beautiful Echi, and apparently Kenta. Oh well. As long as one of them had noticed, he supposed the result was the same, and now he would get to spend some time alone with his friend. The thought sent warmth and ease all through him. He enjoyed Antony's presence more than anything, and Lord Theodora was surprisingly pleasant as well, but it was relaxing to be with a mere mortal like himself, someone whose history he knew and who had no authority over him. He didn't have to worry about appropriate behavior, not that he was terribly good at remembering to worry about that around Antony, or being respectful. He could just launch right into the things he wanted to say. "Did you know that Messiah wrote love poems for Lord Theodora?" he asked. He'd been waiting all day to tell Kenta about that. "No!" Kenta's jaw fell open and his eyes bulged, just like Hanyu had imagined. "Really?" Hanyu nodded. "Lord Antony told me." "For Lord Theodora? That's amazing, but I suppose it makes sense." Hanyu still wasn't quite sure that it did, but Kenta looked so proud and pleased that he managed to keep his mouth shut for once. "He said that she was only 15 when she wrote them," he said instead, "and that they were terrible. He said that she was also bad at reading aloud. He said I was better, even though I dropped the book on his face." Kenta hesitated for a moment, still smiling, then pressed on. "You seem to be getting along very well lately." Hanyu's grin spread so wide that his cheeks ached. "It's been so good! I can't even believe how good it is!" Kenta squealed and bounced a little on the mattress. "Tell me everything!" "He let me sleep in his bed last night, only sleeping, but it was wonderful, and he fusses over me and fixes my hair and talks to me all the time." "He seems so grouchy. Does he ever stop glaring with those pale eyes looking right through you? I'd be scared to death of him." Kenta gave a theatrical little shudder. "Oh, that's just how he is," Hanyu said with a dismissive wave of his hand that almost caught his friend's shoulder. "He glowers and grumbles all the time, but it doesn't mean anything. He's only really been angry with me once, and I deserved it." "Really? What did you do?" Hanyu felt the now familiar sick twist of shame, but quickly recounted the story of the chest and the robe and the god's ready forgiveness. By the time he finished speaking, Kenta's eyes were wide and round. "He carried you to bed?" he blurted. "That's so romantic! You must have died!" "I almost did," Hanyu said. "He's so strong. I love how easy it is for him to pick me up. I even like how cold his skin is. And those eyes. I know you think they're creepy, but I think... Gods, I hardly know what I think. He's so beautiful, I could just cry all the time." "Don't you already?" Kenta asked, and they both laughed. It was so nice to talk about this with someone who could be uncomplicatedly happy for him. He could get excited, he could be silly, he could squeal and rhapsodize all he wanted without worrying that he would make Kenta resent him. It was, he realized guiltily, very unlike talking with a sow lately. "Do you think he's going to use you?" Kenta asked excitedly, and Hanyu hesitated. "Everyone says he doesn't bed humans," he said. It was a little shocking to hear the words that rattled around in his head all the time pass his lips. "But I want him so much I can't even think straight sometimes. I think I'm falling in love with him, Kenta." Hanyu whispered the last words, hardly able to believe them even as he said them. It was too bold, too fast, too everything. Kenta, however, just started laughing. Hanyu, I could tell that from the moment you started talking about him, he finally managed. You're practically floating, and when you say his name, it sounds like singing. Damn, was he really so obvious? Did everyone know? Did Antony? That was a mortifying thought. What about you? Hanyu demanded. He would never be good at subtly changing the subject, so he might as well barrel right ahead. Lord Theodora seems so nice. Are you happy with her? I am, Kenta said. It's like, you know the families in books? It feels like that here. I always thought that even in personal service there would be so much distance from the gods. And you know how timid I am. I thought there would be these mighty beings waiting to swoop down on me at the least provocation, and I would be so terrified all the time. Hanyu had to admit that his own expectations had not been all that different. But it's not like that. Lord Theodora puts herself on the rotation for cleaning the common area and the washrooms, and she sits with Chihiro all the time and bathes him and changes his clothes when he soils them, and her room is the same size as mine, and she wants me to do and learn about whatever I like, not to make me more pleasing, but just because I like it. I look at the others and I feel, I don't know, I wonder who I'll be after 40 years of living like this, and I'm actually excited to find out. Does that make sense? Hanyu nodded. Her offerings all seem so confident. They are. Our Lord teaches us all to steer the ship, the whole ship. How could you not become confident with this behemoth under your hand? And sometimes the others don't even bow, or they call Lord Theodora by her name, and she just lets them. I'm allowed to call Lord Antony, Hanyu confided, in private at least. Kenta shook his head wonderingly. It's not at all what I thought it would be. I know we're in the middle of the ocean and there's monsters to fight and our masters could break us without even trying, but I feel stronger and safer than I did at the temple. Is that mad? Not at all. Not when he had Lord Theodora, who would pick fights for him and keep him forever and cry for him when he got too old to know her. If it wasn't for Asao, I'd wonder why the temple bothers with polishing us up so much, Kenta said. I guess some masters care about all of that. Asao and his bruises and his pallor, Asao and Lord Marcus, Asao who should be the one squealing with Kenta about the happy surprises of life with Antony. Hanyu didn't care to pursue that train of thought. He cast about for a new topic. What happened to your arm? He asked, pointing at the bandage he'd noticed on his friend's arm. Oh, that? Kenta looked down at it as if he'd forgotten. That's where Lord Antony drank from me this morning.